Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Today our guest is MacKay. He was a professor at the university in Kiev, he was an election observer, he knows Ukraine perfectly as he is an activist for Ukraine since eternity and visited Ukraine many times and works on Ukraine-American relations. Welcome to the studio, Mr. MacKay.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
We are observing since several days and weeks what one can call a fight for Ukraine support in Washington. And we have seen very different positions in this fight. And now everyone is being surprised what is going on as Speaker Johnson has suddenly declared that he supports the bill to provide Ukraine with weapons and other type of support. What is going on in Washington? It is absolutely not understandable from Berlin or Kiev point of view.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that isn't it strange that we are so concerned about these internal disturbances in American politics and that it is so important that we have to care about it and have to try to understand it. When you think about it, this shouldn't be the case at all. It should be that the United States presents a common face to the world, that defends its interests and its own national security, and that it should be very clear that it would support Ukraine. And yet here we are in this position of caring about what Speaker Johnson says and what advisors to President Biden say, and how this all plays out about support for Ukraine and the course of the war. So first of all, it's very strange and it's wrong. Whenever there's dysfunction in American political elites, it turns out to be a very bad thing for the world. And I'm speaking as an observer from Canada, which has very close relations to the United States. But again, we're required to know a lot about the internal doings of American politics in a way that they're not required to know about us, to make their way in the world. But I think the situation of the war in Ukraine is different because the Americans are required to pay attention to what the rest of the world thinks about them. It has to do with their international reputation and their standing in the world and the power and influence they can wield in it. And I think they're finding it's a very uncomfortable position to be in, how their stature has diminished so rapidly, especially over the past 2 years, but also really over the past 10 years since Russia invaded Ukraine.
Indeed, and we have seen that the United States, they have been one of the first nations which provided Ukraine with support during the first weeks, even before the full-scale invasion. But not only the US, like Canada also provided a lot of support for Ukraine. You're currently based in Ottawa, if I'm not mistaken. And what is the main differences between what is the Canadian view, so to say, on Russian-Ukrainian war and what is the US-American view on the Russian-Ukrainian war?
I don't think there actually are very many differences between the actual government policy. If you look proportionally to the size of their economies, Canada and the United States are below the median of what assistance to Ukraine is. We know that the top countries, well, the top country is Estonia and Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Denmark. These are the top contributors as a proportion of GDP. And Canada and the United States are in the bottom half. And given the size of their economies, the United States, the number one economy in the world, and Canada, larger than Russia, and maybe around 10th largest by GDP, this I find is disappointing, that it's not what it should be. Public statements are very similar. But as a Canadian, I'm disappointed that Canada remains aligned to the United States position, which is too timid and not what is required in the war that we're in, and not more aligned with our allies in Europe, particularly allies in Eastern Europe.
Both countries have pretty strong Ukrainian community, especially Canada, but not only Canada, US also has a strong Ukrainian community. And still, we haven't seen a lot of influence from these communities, neither towards the Canadian nor towards the US American governments. What is the reason for that?
They're large in numbers because there's a large Ukrainian diaspora, but astonishingly weak in power. You look at countervailing interests, particularly, say, business interests, and that's why sanctions are so timid. You look at the ingrained bureaucratic instance. So, for example, why have the United States and Canada not expelled diplomats who are in fact spies acting undercover, or closed consulates that are not necessary given the state of relations between these countries? Whereas this has happened in European capitals. There was a tit for tat expulsions just in the last couple of days with Estonia and Russia. So the diaspora, the Ukrainian diaspora, is very weak. I know that the positions that they take are largely ignored. The Ukrainian Canadian community has said for more than 20 years that Canada should have visa-free travel reciprocity with Ukraine. Ukraine allows visa-free travel for Canadians. And we know that the Schengen zone in the EU already has visa-free reciprocity with Ukraine for travel. And this strengthens free trade. Canada has a free trade agreement. So the logic of, well, why wouldn't we support our free trade agreement with the free movement of people, subject to all normal border controls and national security considerations? But there's no answer from the government. So that's what really frustrates me about both the Canadian and the American government. They take these positions, but they give no rationale. There's this institutional inertia. Why won't the United States provide aircraft to Ukraine? And then they don't answer the question. They just say, "Oh, we're authorizing our allies to provide their aircraft. Why won't you provide longer range missile launchers? Oh, we're providing the shorter range versions." There's never a reason why the Canadian and American governments say no.
This is indeed the situation with the weapons, which disturbs Ukrainians a lot, especially the delays from the US, as the US hasn't sent to Ukraine almost anything since several months, especially 155mm artillery shells, which are essential for Ukrainian defense. And that is what nobody in Ukraine can understand, why it took so long to provide Ukraine with weapons until the Republicans have taken the process in their hands and just stopped the delivery, not letting the House to vote on the weapons. Can you explain what is going on in Washington and how is this war is being seen within the Biden administration and within the Republicans?
I think the United States is a very institutional democracy. It's an old democracy with very slowly evolving institutions. And the problem is that this war is fast moving and it doesn't fit into categories that they're familiar with. And I think also that Russian information warfare has exploited this tremendously. Um, I've often thought that Russian information warfare doesn't cause problems. It doesn't even really act as an arsonist to set fire to things. What Russian information warfare does is it looks at the conflict that there already is, and then pours gasoline on the fire. It fuels the fire of what's already there. In other words, it exaggerates the extreme elements. So it takes the tendency of a large part of the Republican Party to conspiratorial thinking and exaggerates that. We can see this, for example, Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine in 2013, 2014 was in fact a CIA coup, right? However preposterous this is, this is the Russian narrative, and then it gets picked up and then amplified by the Russians as it appears here. Also, the fake sites that make it look like they're Americans and so on. And when it comes to this aid issue, the Russians exploited another issue, which is fear about immigration in the United States, and created this as an either-or scenario. Now, we know how Russians exploit this more directly with the border surges they've done to Poland and more recently into Finland. But in the United States, it's more on the information warfare front. We see how this conspiratorial thinking, this extremist language takes hold of a large number of people, and those who are most susceptible to this are those who are on the far right and on the far left. And we see this in Europe as well, very strongly, where, for example, in Germany, Der Linke and AfD can come together on positions where you would say, what would they have to do with each other? And when we get to conspiratorial thinking, like, Ukraine is filled with Nazis, or it's persecuting Christians, or whatever false news is amplified, it finds resonance with these audiences. So I think we see this, unfortunately, played out in the United States because the Russians are very adept at understanding the procedures that Americans are obsessed with. I've often thought that I've observed that Americans are obsessed with legal formalism. Before they even talk about whether they should do something, they immediately want to talk about if they can do it. So the question of whether they should do it never comes up as they drift into discussion about procedure and legal formalism and so on. So you'd say, surely the United States should help Ukraine directly defend itself. And then Americans will immediately, a large number of them will immediately say, Ukraine's not a member of NATO. They can't invoke Article 5 of the NATO treaty, and so on. And the discussion goes in that direction and moves immediately away of the fact of, Russia's at war with you. It's not just at war with Ukraine. There is a war in Europe that is directly threatening U.S. and Canadian national security.
During the World War II, or if you allow me this parallel, nobody asked what are the legal reasons for entering the war. It was just decided, of course, not from the first day of the war in 1939, but still. But if we don't go that far into past, we have seen now a very decisive response by the United States on the attempted attack by Iran on Israel. And the US has delivered support to Israel the first hours after the terrible attack of October 7th, and then during Iran's launch of missiles and drones against Israel. What was the difference here? The drones are the same, saying the Ukrainians, and the same Shahed drones from Tehran, which fly towards Kyiv and towards Tel Aviv.
Mm-hmm. The difference, again, comes back to institutionalization. And I think also we can talk about diaspora communities as well. Israel became independent in 1947 with an overwhelming vote by the United Nations, and it was immediately attacked by its Arab neighbors. And the United States, came on the side of Israel because it was being on the side of the United Nations. That was certainly the justification in 1947. And then we know that Israel was attacked subsequently several times, such as in 1967 and 1973 and so on. And a lobby evolved so that it became institutionalized to support Israel militarily. Ukraine renewed its independence in 1991 because it had been briefly independent in 1918. But it was not at first attacked, and it was put in the American institutional thinking into something called the post-Soviet space. And the idea of spheres of influence never left the Americans, so that uh, the Russian Federation was allowed to call itself the successor state of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was never declared a criminal totalitarian regime, which it was, which should have no successor. Or if it did, it was all the constituent republics who are now independent countries. And so institutionally, the United States was never prepared for the war that was inevitable because Russian imperialism never went away and has always been the essence of the country that we call Russia today, imperialism and colonialism to its neighbors. And we see today the idea of Ruski Mir, Russian world, which is essentially a fascist idea. And it's playing out in what is becoming a global war. And at no point have American institutions adjusted to that. So whereas they adjusted very quickly to the idea of Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East, Israel, you know, home of a strategic interest of the United States that needed to be defended from its enemies. That idea took hold early and has been sustained. But the idea that Ukraine is a democratic and European country, for some reason, just never got hold in the United States. And that has left Americans ill-adapted to deal with the reality that we do have this imperialist power, fascist Russia, at war with democratic Ukraine, and by extension, at war with the West itself.
And that is exactly what I wanted to ask you further, as we know that the United States used what they called, or at least like some advisors in the Biden administration called, the escalation management. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but the basic idea before that was not to provoke Russia too much, not to escalate it too much, but to help Ukraine to a certain extent, but without crossing, so to say, Putin's red lines. What was the main reason for the advisors of the President Joe Biden to use exactly that idea and not, okay, we can provide Ukraine with everything we have and Ukraine will defend its sovereignty?
What stands behind it is an irrational fear of nuclear war, which Russians exploit expertly. United States. Don't forget, the thinking of American elites has, and I mean the intellectual and political elites, also the business elites, has not really changed from 1991 to today. So they really haven't adjusted to the reality that this Ruski Mir is in fact a multinational environment of different peoples, each of which has a right to self-determination and so on. So it hasn't adjusted to that. And what the Americans call escalation management is in fact a rationalization for childish fear, something that is inflamed by Russian information warfare. So I think it's childish, it's dangerously wrong, and it's not borne out in reality. Because the reality is, what is Russia as an empire, as an aggressive colonial power? It's actually a terrorist state, a very corrupt one, an extremely inefficient one, and relatively speaking, weaker to its adversaries than it has been in over 400 years. Um, there's never been an opportunity like this to say, that's it, the age of empires is over. And the Russian Empire, which should have collapsed in 1918 with the rest of the old empires, should finally collapse in the form it's in now, which is as a terrorist state. So this escalation management is a reflection of a fear which has no basis in reality. That the state of Russian nuclear forces is the same state as the rest of its forces and its country: corrupt, inefficient, poorly led, and basically an extension of a criminal syndicate, like everything else. And I don't know if there is a credible threat of nuclear weapons at all from this country, but I do know that there is a very devastatingly effective use of the exploitation of the fear of nuclear weapons. Generations of Americans have grown up with this fear that is never realized and never will be. It's irrational, it's childish, and what's most worryingly, it kills people, and it is destroying cities, and it's tearing us apart. This silly fear that Americans have.
As irrational it has a very real impact on the U.S. Foreign politics. And we know that people who reflect this point of view or this way of thinking, like Jake Sullivan or Sam Sharap or Mr. Kupchan, they are all in favor of the current administration. What is the reason for that? Like the advice which have been provided by Jake Sullivan, they have proven themselves all the time to be wrong. Like starting from the calls not to deliver weapons to Ukraine, it will not make any difference. Russia has infinite resources, and. We have seen that all these advice have always been proven as wrong, but still they form the foreign policy of the U.S. and being promoted. President Biden or his administration, don't they see that it doesn't bring us or the West to any credible result?
I think people form their ideas early on in their life experience, and it takes a lot to change this experience. And what we see with the American case is there are so many filters to prevent reality from intruding on the illusions that these people hold. And the effect is self-deterrence. And again, these filters are in place because of the heavily institutional character of American democracy. But that, in other words, the Russians aren't to blame for that, but they exploit it effortlessly. So, for example, their disinformation is not actually effective propaganda. It isn't, oh, look, Russia is great. It's just about confusion. And so if the information coming your way is a mess, then the preset ideas are what these people hold on to. The fact that these ideas have been wrong every single time, as you say, doesn't intrude on things. And this is, I think, the effect of the volume of Russian propaganda, not its precision. It's not precise at all. It's just the lie amplified and told many times over. That people believe things that are contrary to their own experience, because they don't let the experience, they don't let the reality of the world around them change their perceptions. In fact, they fear changing their thinking. They fear saying that they were wrong in a way that is not mature, but ultimately self-destructive. The self-deterrence that the United States practices is, in fact, destructive to American power and influence in the world, and ultimately dangerously weakening to its national security.
That is what we have observed, not only in Ukraine, we have seen it before in Afghanistan. Like, one can say whatever one wants about the results of the over 10 years of presence of the US troops in Afghanistan. Was it successful? How much it was a disaster? What should be done later? But the way how the US troops have left Afghanistan, leaving a lot of equipment and practically encouraging everyone to attack the US because it was a demonstration of weakness, says everything. And isn't it like some sort of demonstration of a decision or a wish to restrain from the world politics in Afghanistan, in Ukraine, and maybe tomorrow in Taiwan?
Yes, I think so. You mentioned Afghanistan. Let's look at reality. Where were we just before the Americans made this very sudden withdrawal? 95% of military operations were being carried out by the Afghanistan military, with just 5% participation by Americans. There were a very minor number of casualties to Americans in the last years. Overwhelming casualties were Afghanistan's, and they were succeeding. They were suppressing the Taliban, keeping them over the border with their ally Pakistan. And this could have gone on a long time at reduced cost to the United States in money and in lives lost, and serve the U.S. strategic interest. And yet, that reality didn't inform the decision making for this sudden withdrawal. Early and simple intervention in Ukraine could have stopped it at every stage from escalating, but in fact, refraining from doing simple things escalated the war enormously. At every stage, the Americans have made the wrong decision, and it was always, let's do nothing. Because, and then say, because the Russians will respect that or something. The awareness that Russia is a bully has never gotten through, and the notion that Russians will back down when they're confronted with superior force is never attempted. So, because it would work in days, but it's never been attempted. So I think it's very bad news. The problem is we need a generational change, but I don't think that's hopeful either. I don't think there is a perception. I think there's a large number of the American population who are unhappy with the passivity of the American response, the confused face it presents to the world. They are angry at the needless suffering of Ukrainians, which they know they could prevent. And they just don't know what to make of this paternalistic, oh, we know better approach from advisors to President Biden, and also just wrong-headed thinking from the Republicans. They're just not buying it, and this is really dangerous.
That is an interesting conflict or contradiction. On one hand, we know it better, but on another hand, the only policy they propose is a restraining. Is it a sign that America is on a sort of a stage of isolation, if I may say decline of its political influence? That would be paradoxical, as the largest military power in the world, the largest economy in the world, says, okay, we don't intervene, we pull back.
Yes, it is isolationist. It makes no sense. It also shows that American leadership isn't actually leading. American popular consciousness is that America should be a leader, but when American leaders practically decline to assume that role of leadership at every stage, then you got to wonder what this is all about. You mentioned the United States being the largest military power, the largest economic power in the world. So I'm thinking of some things in the last days. Just the last days on both of these. On the military side, we have 3 senior Biden administration officials saying that they did not support Ukraine striking oil terminals in the Russian Federation. So this was also a way to say that, well, the United States isn't doing it. The United States is, but they also don't want Ukraine to do it. In other words, they're resentful for Ukrainians defending their national security in a way that the United States will not. And on the economic front, so for example, President Biden says he's going to not approve a Japanese firm from buying U.S. steel, even though this goes against free trade principles and doesn't violate U.S. national security or anything like that. It feeds the isolationist sentiment, which I think is actually in the U.S. leadership more than it is in the American people. And that's what's really paradoxical. When you look at World War II, President Roosevelt did lead Americans. He was a little bit more ahead of them. He was discussing things with Churchill. Churchill was always wanting Roosevelt to do more. And Roosevelt did, but he had to bring Americans along with him. And that was very important that he do that. But he was a leader. There was a very strong isolationist movement in the public. Now we see that the isolation movement is in the leadership and not really in the grassroots. And that's a dangerous position for American power.
And this isolationism looks to be pretty bipartisan in both Democratic and Republican parties, isn't it?
Yes. I think there's differences in it. On the Democratic side, it's because the leadership is filled with illusions that they can't get out of or learn from experience about it. And I think with the Republican side, it's because they are overwhelmingly influenced by Russian active measures that they find very fertile ground in the Republican Party. So, it's like Americans have a choice. Do we choose weak and foolish, or do we choose treasonous and dangerous? Unfortunately, that is the state of their leadership.
That is not a good choice and a pretty dangerous one. And as we have seen, the positions on the military support for Ukraine, even before the Republicans have taken control over the House, the U.S. administration under President Biden restricted deliveries to Ukraine and didn't send Abrams tanks for the first year or almost 2 years, artillery only in a very limited volumes, no jets, no other types of equipment, no ATACMS, missiles, etc. Of course, the US supported Ukraine, but as you have described already, to a certain limit. But what we will see in the next months before the presidential elections, will this isolationism lead the presidential campaigns from both sides? Trump, obviously, Biden?
Unfortunately, yes. This is what I've seen time and time again. The message to Ukrainians and other Europeans has always been just wait. You need to wait. And it's always the next election. Unfortunately, that doesn't resolve things because there's always elections in democracies are never convincingly decisive, and there's always the next election. That's the nature of democracy, right? And so you just have to wait. So, for example, President Biden will keep saying no troops and no direct involvement in the war because he thinks it's unpopular. Now, he could lead the American people, as Roosevelt did, to say, hey, this is a dangerous world and we need to be involved in it, but he's not doing that. So I think that's a failure of leadership on his part, that he's reacting to what he thinks is American public opinion instead of leading it. So we're going to see that from him, but the November elections won't change anything. It won't make people who have been indecisive throughout this whole experience of Russian aggression, it won't suddenly make them decisive. So this way of thinking that Russia is this great threat, which has been instilled since the end of the Second World War, or that any intervention in the Russian world is completely hopeless, which has been the way of thinking in the United States for over a century since they gave up on the intervention in the Russian Civil War in 1919. This will not change because of an election. And I look at the experience of Ukrainians, and I just feel so angry about this. Russia invaded in 2014, and Obama backed away from the security assurances in the Budapest Memorandum and refused to intervene, and refused to stop the war then, which he could easily have done with very little effort. And, oh, just wait, because Hillary Clinton is going to win the next election, and she's much stronger on foreign affairs and so on. But then, helped by Russian active measures, Trump won. Oh, just wait. Trump will be convicted for his crimes and treason. Well, they tried twice in the legislature of the U.S., the Congress, and failed. Oh, Biden's in. Just look. And then, given the opportunity of Lend-Lease and so much more, he just declined. So all this just wait for this aid bill to pass, which I hope it does, because Ukraine needs ammunition, and that's important right now. But just wait till November? No, I don't buy it. And why should that be the case? Why should the fate of the world depend on this country that can't get its act together?
Yes, but that is also not only what we hear from the US, it is also what we hear here in Germany, where I am located. And we have all these excuses from our Chancellor Olaf Scholz. How can the world, for example, the European Union, which is a strong economic player and hopefully a political one, how can the world compensate this dependency on the US decision or indecisiveness?
I think a couple of things. Practically, raise the level of support to that of Estonia, proportion to their economies, and then raise the language to the language that has been used by President Macron in recent days, but then act on it. So I think this is something that the EU has to find the confidence to do it. To do this. So, for example, a proposal: why shouldn't the EU carry out border security inside Ukraine to the borders with Belarus and Moldova, the occupied Transnistria? And it's perfectly justifiable. EU already has rules about all countries working together to protect the external borders, right? There's countries in the EU that have no external borders too. There's a couple of them that have no external borders, but they nevertheless have border control officers and they serve in other countries and so on. So, and EU is a candidate for EU membership. There's overwhelming justification for this if you're looking for a bureaucratic reason why you should do this. But there's an overwhelming strategic imperative. Protecting the border inside Ukraine to Belarus and to Moldova will free up Ukrainian armed forces for more efficient deployments. The idea that the armed forces of Ukraine has to alone defend a border all around Belarus, all around the Russian Federation, the battlefront inside occupied Ukraine, and then this rump separatist region, Transdniester in Moldova, is wrong. The EU doesn't ask its own countries with large external borders to do that, and why are they asking Ukraine to do that? It just makes no sense.
And that could be a solution for Ukraine, as Ukraine would be able to move its troops, which are now guarding the Ukrainian Belarusian or Ukrainian Moldovan borders, to the front and release more power. But what I liked very much in your last statement is that we need to raise the level of our actions to the level of what we speak, what we say. And that is what often is lacking in German, American, and other ways of run the foreign politics. Our politicians hold great speeches, but their actions do not fit into these speeches. Thank you so much. It was Michael MacKay, who has spent dealing with the topics of political analysis in Ukraine and support for Ukraine for decades. He was a professor at university in Kiev, elections observer, an activist for Ukraine, and a person who helps Ukrainians to understand the West and the West to understand Ukraine. Thank you so much, Mr. MacKay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to our channel, and wait for the next interviews.